From Harold Washington to Harold's Chicken, and everything in between and beyond, SoCHiology is the exploration of Chicago culture, history, legends, stories, and fiction through a myriad of discussions with Chicagoans themselves. What's up, everybody? It's Twiz Taylor back again with another episode of SoCHiology. This is episode 62. Now, in Bronzeville on King Drive, if you go to 345 Eastgate Place, you're going to see a bronze statue. That statue was created by Allison Sars and installed in 1996, and it represents the Great Migration, or the Great Northern Drive, as Robert Abbott, the founder and publisher of the Chicago Defender, called it. It was during this period where millions of Black Americans and formerly enslaved Blacks came from the South to northern cities such as Chicago. Now, if you look at the statue very closely and pay attention, it's very creative because everything was done intentionally. The suitcase represents the hope and dreams that all of these travelers had in these new cities. If you look at the suit has soles on it, which represents the shoes of these travelers on this journey. The hand is held up to symbolize salutations and welcoming in the new cities such as Chicago, and the statue is intentionally facing north to represent the Northern Drive, the journey. Now, if you ask 10 out of 10 Chicagoans where their ancestors or their grandparents are from, they're going to tell you Mississippi or some type of southern state. For example, my grandma is from Indianola, Mississippi. That's in Sunflower County, Mississippi, within the Mississippi Delta. I asked a couple Chicagoans this very question, and this is what they had to say.
My name is Brittany. I'm from the east side of Chicago, currently residing in Chicago Ridge. And my maternal grandparents are from Chicago. My grandmother is from Chicago, Illinois, born and raised. And my grandfather is from Wetumpka, Alabama, and they still reside there today. And my paternal grandparents are from Gould, Arkansas. My grandfather's from Arkansas. And my grandmother is from Chicago. Her mother is from St. Louis, and her father is from Tennessee. And then on my mother's side, my great-grandparents, they were both orphans. In Chicago, but I think my great-grandmother is from somewhere in New Orleans. I can't trace their lineage back too far as that goes. But yeah, that's all.
What's up, y'all? My name is Tony Richardson II, born and raised in rural Illinois. But yes, due to the Great Migration, all four of my grandparents are from the South. And I will be giving y'all culturally correct ways to pronounce these states. Starting with my mother's side, my grandmother was born in Myrtle, Mississippi, which is about an hour 15 minutes southeast of Memphis. My grandfather was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which is about 45 minutes southeast from Memphis. For my father's side, my grandfather was born in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and my grandmother was born in Tallulah, Louisiana. So my grandparents are from Mississippi and Louisiana. Thank you so much for y'all time.
Hi, my name is Brandy. I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. On my mom's side, my grandmother was born in Clarksdale, Mississippi. My grandfather was born in Okolona, Mississippi. On my dad's side, my grandfather was born in Birmingham, Alabama. And my grandmother, she was born in Macomb, Mississippi.
Hey, what's going on? My name is Victor Johnson. I live in Calumet City, Illinois. My maternal grandparents are from Bessemer, Alabama, and Jeanerette, Louisiana. My paternal grandparents are from Mississippi. I don't know too much about my paternal grandparents, but I do know that my grandfather, who was born in Bessemer, Alabama on my maternal side, was raised in Chicago, whereas my grandmother, who was raised in Jeanerette, Louisiana, came and relocated to Chicago when she was young.
Hey y'all, my name is Njama. I'm from Markham, Illinois, south suburbs, but my grandparents, my granddaddy is from Arkansas and my grandma is from Coffeyville, Mississippi, which, country as hell. And it was only like 3 families that lived down there. All her family, the family some of her brothers married into, and then one other family. And then when they came up here, both of them ended up on the west side of Chicago, K-Town specifically.
Hey, what's going on? My name is Vonzel Scott, currently living on the south side of Chicago in the West Pullman Roseland neighborhood. And my grandparents are from Macklemoresville, Tennessee, which I know nobody ever heard of. I didn't even know where it was before I knew where they were from. But one thing I know is that it's only like one famous person that ever came out of Macklemoresville, Tennessee, and I believe that's Dixie Carter from Designing Women from like back in the 80s TV show. And a saying that my grandmother used to always say when she used to walk around the house all the time, Macklemoresville 10, 3 stores in the cotton gin. Ain't seen a train in God knows when. Now, that's some real history for you right there. So Macklemoresville, Tennessee is where my grandparents are from.
So as you can see, the effects of the Great Migration are long and lasting. On this episode, I talked with historian Brian Hayes. Brian Hayes is a brilliant historian. He built his family tree up to about 60,000, 70,000 names. That's not an exaggeration, that's a fact. Brian Hayes is going to give us the pros and the cons of the Great Migration, the nuances, the complexities of it, because it wasn't always black and white. So I hope this episode inspires you, and pay attention because he has a lot to offer and a lot to say. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So yeah, let's get into it. The Great Migration, everybody knows what it is. You've lived in Chicago your entire life, correct? Give or take. You was born and raised here.
Right. Born and raised here. The time I was away from Chicago was during my years in the United States Marine Corps and my undergraduate and graduate time in Macomb at Western Illinois University.
Correct. So with that being said, can you let's just get into detail about the Great Migration and tell the listeners, the viewers. Obviously, they know what it is, but tell us about the different phases of the Great Migration. What was the reasons for it? And how did so many of these people from Mississippi, Louisiana end up in Chicago?
Okay.
They ended up all over the place, but Chicago was a huge destination. So let's get into that, step by step.
Okay. So you had several factors. You had the racial violence in the South, the lack of opportunities, the boll weevil, which was a bug that actually killed the cotton crop. You had I'm trying to remember the name of, I know what it was, but I'm trying to remember the name. It was like an exclusion act that at this time, World War I was taking place.
Got it.
And so the United States government prevented people from Germany, I want to say Italy, certain European countries, they prevented them from immigrating to the United States.
Okay.
And then when the United States went into the war in 1917, there was a shortage of male employees and a lot of urban factories. And so they needed to fill those spots.
Yeah.
And so black men were our available labor force, as well as the role of Robert Abbott, who was the publisher of the Chicago Defender, who what were their name? Come on, Brian. The men who were on the train.
The Pullman Porters.
The Pullman Porters. Pullman Porters, they would take copies of the Defender on their routes down south. And, they would provide black people with the newspapers. But the funny thing was, black people could get killed for having a Defender.
Yeah.
Because
I heard about that.
Yeah, because white people treated black people like shit, but they also didn't want them to leave. So you had situations like in my family where they own their own land, like in southeast Mississippi, they own their own land and so on and so forth. But in the Mississippi Delta area, a lot of people were sharecroppers. And so with sharecropping, allegedly, you would perform work for the person who owned the land. They would provide you a form of credit in the form of the resources that you needed, the tools, the seeds, and so on and so forth.
Shelter.
But people never seem to be able to get ahead in their accounts. And so the landowner would be like, oh, well, this year's crop, it didn't turn out like we wanted. Hopefully next year will be better. And so it was a form of slavery without the legalized version of it. People had to get permission to leave, that sort of thing. And so you would have families escaping in the middle of the night, or not, not telling anybody that they were leaving. And so the Illinois Central Railroad played a huge part in people leaving from Mississippi and arriving in Chicago. And so a lot of the ultimate destination of people from the South to the North really depended upon which state they lived in.
Got it.
So a lot of people from Alabama, Georgia, Florida, those people wound up on the East Coast, like Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, Boston. And so it's funny that you mentioned it earlier, but most Black people in Chicago, their families are from Mississippi.
Yeah. Yep. My grandmother, as you know, because you assisted me with that, is from Sunflower County, Mississippi.
Yeah.
And a lot of her siblings stayed down there. So it's like a whole branch of family members that I've never even met, never even knew of. And they're still down there. A lot of my friends' grandparents came from Mississippi, as well as Louisiana also. Louisiana is like another destination that I hear about a lot. What destination origin that I hear about a lot? Louisiana, Mississippi. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we got people, who wound up in Chicago from Arkansas and, some of those other Tennessee.
Yeah.
But you actually had several migrations. You had mentioned that earlier. And so the first one I will speak of is the one that began right before World War I.
Okay.
And, you would have people that would, go to Chicago. They would like it. They would communicate with family members that there are opportunities here. And some might come and stay. Some might come and go back. Like I have one branch of my family. It was funny. Like a couple of years ago, I had connected with my cousin Sam Gage.
Okay.
And Sam just turned 80. So Sam had an older first cousin named Charlie Gage. Charlie's also my cousin. And Charlie remembered their grandfather. Sam had never met him, but Charlie remembered him. And so they had come to Chicago from a community in Wayne County, Mississippi called Buckatona, which is, I got a whole lot of family down there. And Charlie said that their grandfather used to cut his hair, but he didn't like the cold weather in Chicago. So he moved back down south. He moved to Mobile.
Okay.
And he died down there in 1944. And so, a variety of reasons, why people came. But one of the terms that historians use are push and pull factors. Different things that were going on that pulled people here, as well as things going on down there that pushed people out.
Yeah. And it's interesting because so we still on the first migration right now.
Right.
Interesting because like you said, a lot of Black ancestors, they was taking this leap of faith to come north for better opportunities and to escape the racial violence, the lynching, that was going on, only to come to the north and still face racism just in a different form.
We actually have a term for that. In the South, we had de jure segregation. De jure meaning that the segregation and the second class statuses of Black people was actually legalized.
Yeah.
Whereas in the North, it was what we call de facto. So when I was growing up, there was a community called Bridgeport. You knew not to go to Bridgeport being a Black person, even though there was no law that said that you couldn't.
Yeah.
And so something that you mentioned, like whenever people talk about, the work that I've done, whether good or bad, I always have to give thanks to my cousin Marjorie. Cousin Marjorie is my grandmother's first cousin. She was the oldest of the first cousins. And she actually did a family tree for us back in 1997 at our 25th anniversary family reunion.
Okay.
And so when I started on mine, when I was thinking about it, I was actually sitting poolside in the French Quarter at a family reunion with a drink.
Okay.
My cousin Barbara, and I told her, I was like, I'm gonna work on the family. I'm gonna start working on the family tree because I had met some cousins I had never heard of.
Yeah.
And they were fairly close relatives, but I had never met them. And so when I told cousin Marjorie that I was going to work on it, and she was like, "Why?" and I explained my reason why. She was like, "Okay." She said, "Well, you nosy enough," and I think I made a face. She said, "Baby, I meant it in a good way."
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, "If you need any help, just call me." And so
Mm-hmm.
she laid the foundation, and then I just kind of started digging. And so I can honestly say that, even with my background in history and so on and so forth, I never would have been able to do what I was able to do without her information.
Yeah.
And so it gave me a place to start. And she and I actually talked about the pros and the cons of migration. And she said that, whereby it did offer economic opportunities to Black people, they also lost their kids to the streets.
Mm.
So let's say the lure of activities in Chicago, drugs, gangs, all the things that we call urban ills didn't exist in these rural environments. Like the town where my grandmother and cousin Marjorie came from, at one time, my family owned the entire town.
Wow. And what town is this?
It's called Battles, Mississippi.
Battles, Mississippi. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's just, it's amazing to me to be able to look at documentation and see it and see these family members, living next to each other on these family homesteads.
Yeah.
And I went down there in April for spring break because my cousin Reggie, he was telling me about this app that they had found that showed who owned what property. And so I put we still have land down there that's on my great grandfather's. And so I put the name in, and it showed me exactly where it was. I knew the general area, and I was like, wow. And then I was able to see other relatives who owned land nearby.
Mm-hmm.
I saw some of my cousins who had a whole lot of land, there. And then I saw the names of there were some unfamiliar names. And so I looked them up, and they were like, okay, they don't look like us. So some of these people had purchased land from our family members, or they swindled people out of the land, or what have you. But one of the things I've been trying to able to communicate to my family is like, damn, we own the whole town. And you look at a place like Chicago where people are paying ridiculous amounts of money to rent or to own. And, you look to your left, you look to your right, there's another family right there. You can't even breathe. And when I went to look at the property, my cousin Brenda, I was at her house and I was explaining it to her. And so she said, I'm going to show you where that is. And so we were driving, and she had this memory. She said, I wonder if Wallace Chapel is still there. And I'm like, Wallace Chapel? She said, yeah, it was a church we used to go to when we were kids. And so as we're approaching, she told me to stop. She said, pull over. And she said, there go Wallace Chapel right there. And I'm like, where? And she was like, move your head. And I moved my head, and I saw a building in the woods. So the woods had grown over everything. But I'm looking at that, and she said, okay, we're going to get back in the car. And she was like, and I'm going to show you where where the land is. And so she's looking, and by the time we stopped, it was about 3 city blocks. That was all our land.
Wow.
And then there was a road that like a little dirt road that went to the back, and she told me to take the back road, but there was a guy coming out. He looked at me and I looked at him, and she was like, yeah, we going in there. And she was like, ain't you such and such? And he was like, yes, ma'am, because down there everybody's yes, ma'am, and yes, sir. So she said, yeah, this is my cousin Brian, and his family owned the land, and we taking him back there. And he was like, okay. So he moved, we went back there. Then he came back about 10 minutes later because he had went and picked his kids up from school. Turns out he's one of my cousins.
Yeah.
Because he's like, you Brian Hayes from Chicago. And I'm like, yeah. He's like, I'm your cousin such and such.
Wow.
So, yeah. So, looking at it, it's like all these other people that live over there are family members. But once upon a time, all of that was part of a family homestead.
Yeah.
On cousin Marjorie's father's side.
Mm.
So she's related to me. Her mother and my great grandfather are brother and sister, but this land they have bought was on her father's side. Mm-hmm. So her father had a brother who was married to one of my cousins, and I don't know the particulars. They wound up splitting up something that she did with a preacher, but the land that they have, like his second wife was these people's grandmother.
Got it.
Who was actually her first husband was another one of my cousins.
Family tree is complex.
Yeah, it's complex. Yeah. So
Wow.
I mean, it's a good thing, and understanding or finding out what it was that the people did to get this land and being able to hold on to it.
Yeah.
So you have family members arguing about land, like they didn't put in work for it, and not understanding that a lot of these people had the homestead land, and with the Homestead Act, the government gave you 5 years to make improvements on the land. And if they determined that you didn't, you wouldn't get the land. So basically you had a lot of people working 5 years for free.
Yeah. And a lot of people that migrated, I assume, were families that didn't have these opportunities or these, homes.
Well, actually,
they do.
Well, you had it was kind of like a luck of the draw. So, like with my family members who wound up owning land, I want to say that they were cash poor. Okay. So more than likely they homesteaded it. And then unfortunately, a lot of the records are not online. And so for me to be able to confirm that information, I would have to go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C.
Oh.
Yeah.
And then so you talk about how your family had this entire city, Battles, Mississippi, right?
Well, a town.
Like,
less than 1,000 people.
Right. But nonetheless, that's still huge. That's still huge. So if your entire family owns a town, the likelihood of you getting in trouble is very low, right? But you come to Chicago, like you said, people was losing their family to the streets, losing their kids to the streets, because of all of the nightclubs, the brothels, what I'm saying, things like that. So it's kind of like a culture shock when you could come up here.
You could still get in trouble down there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my brother keeps telling me I need to write a book, and I'm like, nah. But then situations like this bring to mind like all the different things that I've learned from family members who've been generous enough to share the information.
Yeah.
So you had juke joints.
That's correct.
Where things could jump off, generally over women.
Yeah.
So I've had cousins.
Most beef is.
Yeah, I've had cousins who were killed or killed people, in juke joints. Then you had the situations where racial encounters with white people,
which was
we've had that.
Yeah.
I learned about a story on my father's mother's father. So my great grandfather as I was researching, I learned that he was a teacher. That, that freaked me out. I'm like, what? Like 15 years after slavery, he's a teacher. And they lived in Alabama and they moved to this community called Buckatuna, and I didn't know why.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't find out until like within the last year why he moved to Buckatuna. So I got a lot of family in Maywood.
Okay.
That I was able to connect with through research and DNA testing. And they've been having family reunions since at least the 90s. And so they had a document, so their family is descended from a lady named Tempe Newton Robinson, who is my great-great-great-grandfather's sister.
Okay.
They had information that said that he killed a white man over his daughter, and he went to Canada. And I'm like, well, if Wakatana is Canada, he made it. So in Tempe's family, July 4th, 1930, one of her grandsons got into it with a white guy, got to be a little bit bigger.
Mm-hmm.
They wound up shooting one of her sons to death on his front porch, lynched her grandson the next day, and basically put a hit out on the whole Robinson family. So all of them booked up and left. They wound up in Coahoma County, Mississippi, LaFleur County, Mississippi, Humphreys County, Mississippi. Some ultimately wound up in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is the home of the NBA Hall of Fame. Well, the Basketball Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
And some wound up in Portland, Maywood. I mean, and they lost their land.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
Lost their land. And so they knew, they had information about what had happened to my great-great-great-grandfather that my family didn't know. And so when I look at the family research, it's like this huge puzzle that people have different pieces to.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm certainly not responsible for all of the information, but you can kind of call me the crypt keeper.
Yeah, yeah.
It come to me, I get it, and I don't forget it because it's too important. And this research has made me really, really cognizant of things like Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I got this information, and somebody asked me a question, I can readily recall it, but what happens if I'm unable to provide that information? Or what happens if I go out tonight and get hit by a drunk driver? Who's going to have that information? And more so, who actually cares about the information?
Yeah.
And so at this stage of my life, I actually spend more time communicating with family members who I wasn't aware of their existence before 2010 than those family members who I've known my entire life. So it's kind of like, I had a journey from 1968 to 2010, and I came to a crossroads, and I went down a road, and nobody came with me. I met other people on this road.
Yeah.
So we're all following the same path together.
Yeah. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And that's how it is. Like when you unlock these family trees and you start digging deeper into it. And that's why, the Great Migration is so important, because, you just never know the stories of these families. Like you say, it could be many reasons why they left. It could be many things that happened when they got here. Like you say, you got family in Maywood and you from Woodlawn. So that's that's cross Cook County.
Well, that's crazy. Like, because when I look at my family, I got my mother's family and my father's family. And so when I started doing the research, it was on my father's family. That's the one I knew.
Gotcha.
But as I started researching my grandmother's family, like a couple of years after that, my mother's father's mother, her family arrived in Chicago from Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1901.
1901.
Yeah. Her grandmother died in 1902 in Chicago. My great grandmother, her father was white.
Okay.
So I don't know if it was a consensual sort of situation or,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but they came to Chicago. That's my earliest branch of my family that was in Chicago. Both my parents were born here. My 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 mother's father, he was born here.
Mhm.
My mother's mother was born in Pulaski, Illinois. I want to say she came to Chicago around 1943, 1944 with her mother
Got
and
it.
her sister. Her mother was already living here. Her mother was from Pulaski. Her mom sent for her and her sister.
Okay.
My father's mother, the one from Battles, they came to Chicago in 1944.
And was that the last? That was the third phase of Great Migration, correct?
Well, I mean,
Jordan.
I look at it like when people think of history, they want to do these timelines. Well, from here to here. Well, I would say it was an ongoing thing. You had more so. You had these major incidents, like you had World War I, where now it's a labor shortage, and they trying to get people to come up. Then you had World War II, where they needed people working in the defense industry. So you had a lot of Black people, like from Louisiana, Texas. They went to California. I even had some family members from Mississippi that went to California.
Mm-hmm.
But still in all, a lot of it was about economic opportunity. I mean, in spite of the violence. Unfortunately, the violence was something that they were accustomed to. It's kind of like we live in communities in Chicago, and they can be good or bad. What makes a community good or bad are the people who live in it.
Yeah.
And something happens, we see it. We know it was Rollo and Lil Man because we saw them, and we don't say anything. And people are like, well, snitches get stitches or whatever. It's like, well, if we don't take care of our community, who will?
Mm-hmm.
But then when you had these situations down south, and you had this violence that was being committed by white people against Black people, nothing happened. Black people did it to each other. The law didn't really care. So we have this survival mechanism that American society has just, really forced us to adapt. And so I'm just very proud of the fact that all these Black people, these descendants of people who were kidnapped and enslaved, are continuing to survive and thrive in this country that never wanted us.
Yeah, never wanted.
After our after the end of our free labor, they had no need for us.
Yep, none at all. And as a parent, with that's why they tried their best to kill us off. That's why they, don't give us the rights that we deserve. And all of that. It's very apparent. And it's interesting because you ask a Black person where your people from, they're gonna say somewhere down south. But you ask a white person where they're from, they're gonna say, oh, Italy or Ireland or Germany.
Yeah.
It's like, this is our, I hate to say our origin because we didn't originate in these states, but this is what we know.
Right.
You can still do those ancestry tests, and you could get deep and become blessed to trace your lineage to an African country, a Caribbean country. But for majority of us, Mississippi, the buck stops in Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia.
Unfortunately, we didn't get to take the tour of Ellis Island.
Yeah. Unfortunately, absolutely.
Yeah.
Came through the slave harbors. And
Charleston, Mobile,
mm-hmm.
Washington D.C.
New Orleans had one too. Yeah.
Yeah, they had them up and down the eastern seaboard. Like some I was mentioning to my kids a couple of months ago, like regarding the American Revolution. At that time, most people living in America lived within 50 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. Whatever colony they were in, they lived, near, because you still had the Native Americans, holding it down.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you were with the migration, so you had Black people who would come to Chicago, and most of them will find themselves in the Black Belt that we now know as Bronzeville. And so the residential opportunities were limited. The employment opportunities were limited.
Yeah.
The educational opportunities
big time limited.
were limited.
Yeah.
So you had Phillips High School, then you had
Dunbar.
DuSable High School. Dunbar was the third one.
Okay.
And so, Black people in that area, they went to those schools. I know Latrice's stepdad, Mr. White, he was in the first class at Harlan High School. At that time, like, they went to Harlan because they wouldn't let them go to Morgan Park. And I mean,
Morgan Park was all white at one point. Yeah. Morgan Park, CBS, I believe too. Yeah. They was all white.
But I know. Yeah. So
Thornton was all white. You go to the burbs, out in Harvard.
Yeah,
that was all white.
Yeah. You hear these stories, and what I would call the contemporary people, they would hear this stuff and they wouldn't believe it. Like, what do you mean? We didn't live here. And so, Black people being, confined to these certain areas, and there was always a housing shortage. They couldn't buy because they couldn't buy anywhere. You couldn't get financing from the banks because banks wouldn't give Black people mortgages. And so you had these landlords that would divide up these apartment buildings or these houses that they own called kitchenette. So you basically paying for one room, everybody sharing a bathroom. I try to get people to show, there's a scene early in the 1961 movie, A Raisin in the Sun, where Travis and Walter Lee are running into the hallway to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Because the building is sharing that bathroom. So the Black people in the first wave of the migration, they lived in the Black Belt. And, we would like to think of it like a paradise, all these Black people. Well, I would say, listen to what Quincy Jones had to say about growing up in Chicago. Did you ever see an interview with him?
No, I didn't see that interview that you're speaking of.
Yeah, different interviews that he's given about growing up in Chicago and the gang stuff that you had to deal with.
But I'm familiar with the thoughts he had.
Yeah.
With the thoughts he had, though. Yeah.
And so the inability of Black people to move out of these Black communities with, this Black community, the inability to purchase property outside of these communities. You had overcrowding. And as other migrations, the later migrations came, a lot of those people wound up on the west side. And so you also had these conflicts, Black people in Chicago, the ones who had been here, like and Black people who were coming up from Mississippi. They treated them like country Bamas. They don't know this, they don't know that, they doing such and such on the sidewalk. And I mean, and we still had that in the Black community where we look at other people like,
Yeah.
but you know, they were all really in the same situation.
Just a different year.
Yeah, you know, so, but you know, the the people on the west side, you know, dealing with the south side too. The restrictive covenants that, you know, communities had, that all the neighbors had to agree to, that prevented the property from being sold to a black person. Do you know what the first restrictive covenant was created?
I do not. I want to say University of Chicago, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, Hyde Park.
Yep. Okay. Oh, so I did know.
So
Yeah.
So the process for banks denying loans for mortgages for black people, that was ruling for documentation that came from the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
So the federal government has had they've had a hand in all this. The redlining policy, that was something that came from the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
If a community had one black family, it was considered a red line.
And then
so
white flight, you know.
Yeah. I mean, so you had suburbs that were created, you know, with people being able to move because of the GI Bill.
Mm-hmm.
You know, daddy fought in Italy or daddy fought in the Pacific. Well, my granddaddy fought too.
Mm-hmm.
But black men had a real hard time getting the GI Bill.
Yeah.
And then even if they did get it, a bank wouldn't give them a mortgage because the government said that, nah, you can't get no black person a mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
So you still fighting this stuff. Like I said, the red line,
nothing has changed but the year.
Yeah, the restrictive covenants, and then where you had the block busting where you had these white property owners who saw an opportunity to make money because it's a housing shortage. They would scare these white people by hiring a black man to drive through the neighborhood, or a black woman to be pushing a stroller with a baby, and then calling the people's house saying, well, did you see that? And these people losing money on their houses, and then the property owners tripling their profit because they were selling to the black people on contract. And you got
it's very shrewd tactics, very shrewd tactics.
Yeah.
And it's like, we know racism and capitalism go hand in hand. They're conjoined twins. So it's
right.
Like you see all of these black Americans coming up off the trades into this big city. Chicago is already a big city, but now you see all these black folks coming up here, and you got a lot of white people that was angry about it. You got a lot of people that was angry about it, but they didn't show it. They just was like, you know what, this is an opportunity to make some money. And it's just like
they wouldn't even let black people join unions.
Yeah. So it's like it goes back to
so in an urban environment, particularly if you work in a field like a skilled craft or a skilled trade, unions. So you can't get a job because you black or you not in the union, but the union won't let you in because you black. And they try to act like a lot of this stuff didn't happen, and like this stuff going on, like yesterday, Roe versus Wade, absolutely sucks.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll put that aside for a minute. Like something happened, it's like, well, it's a dark moment in our history. Well, our history always been dark here. So y'all speaking about you all, like I said, we're constantly overcoming struggles and barriers, being thrown in our way. And it's just something I want our young people to understand, that just because it's not illegal to date somebody who don't look like you, don't mean that the society approves of it. I'm looking at with Roe versus Wade, I'm like, okay, same-sex marriage is definitely coming next. Interracial marriage, I can definitely see that on the table. Even though the person who said these changes need to be made is Clarence.
Man, I was about to say it. I was about to
Right,
say it. Like,
yeah,
you want to talk about hypocrisy at its finest? Like,
yeah, yeah,
that man is stuck in a he's stuck in the Twilight Zone for real. Delusional.
yeah.
Delusional.
But
Big
like they
time
say, all your
delusional.
skin folk,
Clarence Coon
ain't kin
Thomas.
folk.
I'm gonna say his name. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm independent.
Yeah.
I ain't gotta worry about nobody taking me off there. Like, yeah, it's crazy, man. But you make a good point. Interracial marriage, right? Same-sex marriage. Black women's bodies being regulated. We've been enduring this for so long.
But
have endured it.
but it's like, see, it's an issue now because it's not just happening to minority women.
Yeah, correct.
Who
correct.
they've advanced medicine by experimenting on these women. And now you had a situation where, oh my God, if I get pregnant, yeah, if your daddy rape you and you get pregnant, you gotta have a baby.
Stuck.
Yeah, but this is the real America.
Yeah, the real America. So so the Great Migration definitely had its pros and cons, as all things do. And like we said earlier, Chicago was a huge destination for it. And I'm sure you ask any Black Chicagoan where they grandparents from, they're gonna say somewhere down south. Very rarely are they gonna say, oh, they're from here, or like you say, even Southern Illinois. Because there's a lot of Black folks from Southern Illinois too.
Yeah, like I said, my grandfather.
Pulaski, right?
I mentioned my mother's mother was from Pulaski. My father's father's from Cairo.
And that's like the southernmost city.
The last. It's the last. They call that area Little Egypt.
Little Egypt.
And so that's the last town in Illinois before you leave out across the Mississippi and go to Missouri. Mm-hmm. And so my grandfather's family, we were growing up, he used to tell us that his grandfather fought in the Civil War. We thought he was lying until I found out it was true. That his mother's mother, my great grandmother, was my great grandfather's third wife. So when he died sometime around 1904, his previous wife sued my great grandmother for his Civil War pension. His father was he was born somewhere in Tennessee in the early 1860s during the Civil War. My thinking is that he and his family were brought to Cairo to do work for the Union Army because Tennessee was a Confederate state.
Correct.
But Grant captured Tennessee.
Oh, so he took it over. I didn't know that.
They took it over. And that was one of the reasons that in the 1864 election, Abraham Lincoln selected Andrew Johnson as his vice presidential running mate, because he was a Republican, but he was a slave owner, racist. But now that they kind of got Tennessee in the fold, he selected him.
And Andrew Johnson was like one of many worst things that could have happened to free Black Americans at that time after the war and after Abe Lincoln died, because he basically undid everything Abe Lincoln and Sherman Sherman tried to do.
Well, Lincoln overruled Sherman.
Really?
Sherman was talking about the 40 acres on the mule. Lincoln overruled him.
And we know Lincoln ain't what we was taught in school. We know that, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah. So
right.
we know.
So, people talk about the Emancipation Proclamations. Okay. Yeah. You're freeing slaves on land that you don't own. I mean, you don't have no control over, yet it wasn't enforced in those areas that were controlled by the Union. like Kentucky
Mm.
and Delaware that still had slavery. So
Hypocrisy.
yeah,
It runs
yeah.
deep.
But what it kind of did, it just kind of laid the framework for Black troops to be able to fight. So I haven't done any research on this. I'm sure we'll probably support it. Without the Black troops, the North loses.
Mm. I've heard that before. I've heard that
They
before.
they lose. And
Yeah.
so I remember in grad school, I wanted to do this. In grad school, you have to do a research project for each class, and so I wanted to do a research project on the continuation of American slavery after 1865. And so when you have before you do your research, you have to do a proposal for your professor. And my professor rejected it. He was like, no, slavery was going to die a natural death. And
Sure.
tremendous amount of respect for this professor. But I think it depends on one's perspective, that you have people going to war to keep slavery, even people who did not own slaves, even people who didn't have a chance in hell to own a slave, as well as people looking at Caribbean islands, looking at Mexico, looking at Central America, and invading these places to establish a foothold in slavery. So,
yeah. Yeah, and died natural death. I mean, we talked about sharecropping earlier, which is why many of these families left the South to come to places like Chicago, Detroit. We had sharecropping, you had the convict lease system. All of these are different variations of slavery, even though it's not chattel slavery as we knew it when we first came here in the 1600s. It was still slavery. You feel me? Because you couldn't go nowhere. You was literally under the control of the state or whoever owned the land at the time.
right.
So died natural death. Yeah. In what world? Because not in this one. Must be another multiverse universe. Nah, not here. And it's still going on.
Right. So with Mississippi, I didn't have any family members from the Delta area.
Okay.
I had family members who moved to the Delta in the 30s and the 40s. My cousin, he passed away a couple of years ago. My cousin Kurt, he was telling me about he and my cousin May Rose, their first cousins. So I actually have to call her today. She's 92. She called me the other day and left a message. And I didn't know. I had posted something on Facebook yesterday, and her niece tagged me, and she said, "Did you talk to Aunt May?" And I was like, "No, about what?" And she was like, "She called you." I was like, I ain't talked to her. I'm like, you know what? Let me check my voicemail. And I checked. I'm like, you know what? She did call me, so I'm gonna call her back. But I'm sitting with them. We're at a family reunion picnic, and I was asking them about their grandfather. And so another one of these weird situations. So their grandfather and my father's mother are first cousins. But their grandmother is the aunt of my great grandfather. So they like double related. They double related. And I know that he had died in 1936, and I was asking them, did they remember him? And so she remembered him. She said that, they used to go to his house, and he would take them to the store, and, he would ask her if she wanted anything, and she would always get cloth. And I was like, cloth? And she was like, yeah, I take cloth from my mom, could make outfits, she could make dresses for me and my sister and pants for my brothers. And then Kurt was like 2 years older than her. He said, no, I met him once. I said, you met him once? He was like, yeah. He said, because we left battles and we moved to the Delta. to sharecrop. He said, well, mama got a letter from him and he was asking her to take over the land when he passed away. He said, so we went to see him. He's like, that's the only time I met him. He said, when he passed away, he was like, we wound up going back. And I was like, well, I'm like, your mother still had a brother living there. He was like, yeah, but granddaddy didn't trust him. And then he was talking about when he said when his father died in 1965, they moved his mother to Chicago and they sold their land. Because this is the land they had got from the grandfather. And I said, how much was it? He said 320 acres. I almost died. What? That's 320.
Wow.
320. So I've walked on land that family members own. You can get you can literally walk, and it's still their property.
Wow.
But here,
wow,
you cross the street, you're in another gang territory.
Yeah. You gotta be careful.
It's crazy.
You could go from O Block to Hookahville real quick. Yeah.
And so, he was telling me how he was like, just kind of going down the road. He was like, it was all family members that, they own this land. It's just, it's amazing to me. But I also know that, that town wasn't unique from a standpoint of you had a lot of Black people who created Black towns after slavery because of their relationship or the lack thereof with the people who had once owned them.
Yeah. Comfort,
So they, and they wasn't looking to be with these people.
They didn't want to be with these people, he said. Our ancestors didn't want to be around the same people that mistreated them, the same people that enslaved them. And understand, a lot of families still remained in the South during Reconstruction, during, the early 20th century. And it wasn't because they were afraid to come north. It was always situational. And it was always came down to what was best for the family in that time. Some families thought coming to the north, such as Chicago or Detroit, was best. Some families thought staying down there was best too. It all varied, and it wasn't no right or wrong answer. So I hope this episode inspired you. I hope it encouraged you to get to piece together your family tree and get that knowledge from your ancestors, your grandparents, while they're still around. Because trust me and believe me, this is information that is beyond valuable, and you do not want to let it get away. Learn your family history, get to know it while you can right now. If you enjoyed this podcast, whatever platform you're listening to it on right now, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, etc., leave a 5-star review and a comment. Let us know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to our sister podcast, Mogul Motivation, from True Stories Media.